So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar this afternoon to celebrate National Hospitality Day. My name is Deborah Adams, and we're going to be discussing this afternoon food cost control. Now, I know that some of you attending the webinar today I've already met in some of the sessions, so it's lovely to see you joining us for today's event. So I'm sharing with you some slides which are available afterwards if you'd like to drop me an email if you'd like a copy of those slides. There's also a Q&A, so if you'd like to pop any questions into the Q&A, I will attempt to keep an eye on those as we progress as well and have a go at answering those as we progress through this short session this afternoon. So today we are looking at food cost control. My name is Deborah Adams and my company is Arena for Finance, and we specialise in courses for the hospitality industry. So courses related to food cost control, of course, but also finance for non-financial managers. We also run courses on budgeting and forecasting and planning, and really everything that's commercially related. We have short courses, we have longer courses, so do have a look at our events page. And we also have some online resources on our Finance for Hospitality platform as well. And I'll talk to you about that a little bit more later on today. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we only have a fairly short time together, of course, but this has been a time of really unprecedented high levels of costs in all of our hospitality operations, but food cost has been probably impacted the most. And so we've seen really extensive increase in food cost over the last year or so. And whilst inflation is starting to level off, there is really no sign at the moment that food cost is starting to go down overall. So during this session, I'm going to focus in on a few tools and techniques to help us to control the gross profit and also the bottom line of our P&L as well. So, of course, the increase in food cost has been relentless over the last year, really at quite an unprecedented level. And Fourth Hospitality, who write a number of reports and do some research in this area, they've been able to actually put some numbers to this. And so you look at the size of these increases: 36% for milk, 22% up for bread, 19% for flour. So that's way above the rate of inflation, isn't it? So inflation has hit over 10% in the UK over the last year, but food costs have been rising at a much higher rate. And then chicken at 15% and beef at 6% as well. And so this compares to UK inflation really around about 10%, and overall food inflation has been almost 20% over the last year. So that makes it extremely difficult for us to hit our gross profit targets in these conditions. So at the same time, today I also wanted to talk about food waste as well, so reducing the amount of waste that the business produces, and of course that also impacts on our food cost percentage as well. So I'm going to be bringing in some of the ideas from UK Hospitality and also from WRAP during this session as well, and there will be a list of resources at the end. So just a quick reminder of what we're talking about. We're talking about the calculation for cost of sales. And the cost of sales calculation is based on the opening inventory plus the purchases minus the closing inventory. And this is really the best way to calculate our cost of sales, that is to actually take stock. So we can do this weekly, we can do this monthly as an approach to calculating the figure for the cost of sales. And we can do the same calculation for our food as well as for our beverage. Now, the question is, do we take stock every week or every month? Well, not all businesses do. You may well take stock for beverage on a monthly basis, maybe not for food. And that might be because you're using instead the purchases figure. So using your purchases as the basis of the cost of sales. And that's fine as long as your opening inventories and closing inventories are fairly consistent. So just to look at this quickly with some numbers, I've chosen some really easy numbers here so we can do the maths in our heads. If we're looking at the calculation for the cost of food, well, you take how much stock do you have at the beginning of either the week or the month. So here I've got £7,000 worth. That's at the cost value of that inventory. The closing food inventory, so what we had at the end of the month. And in this example, I've purposely kept those two figures the same. And then we've got the purchases that we've made during that period. And in this case, we're looking at a month. So using that formula, the opening stock plus the purchases minus the closing stock means that we've used £27,000 worth of food during the course of the month. And if we compare that to the net sales, and when I say net sales, I mean the sales without the VAT. So with VAT would be gross sales, so that's what the customer pays. In our accounts, we work with the net sales, so the sales without the VAT. So in order to calculate then what we're actually using, well, the cost of the food used would be 27,000. Now that 27,000 is what's actually gone from our kitchens, our storerooms and so on. And hopefully it's what's sold to the customer. But of course, the difference could be wastage. And that represents then a food cost percentage of 27%. So that's 27,000 divided by 100,000. And then the sales minus the cost of sales equals what we call gross profit. So here we are. So sales minus the cost of sales equals the gross profit, which we can express in pounds and also in percentage as well. So this cost, the food cost or the beverage cost, is a type of variable cost. It means that the cost changes in direct proportion to the level of business. And that's why we talk about it as a percentage, because it's a variable cost. And so it's one of the few variable costs in our P&L. It's the cost of the food on the plate. It's the cost of the drink in the glass. These are all examples of variable costs. Of course, there are lots of other costs in our P&L for our business as well, and a lot of these are fixed costs. So these are costs that you incur whether you have customers or not. And typically they would include things like our permanent staff as part of the utility cost. Some of the utilities is variable, but there's a fixed element there. Rent, insurance, business rates. These are all examples of fixed costs. So if we take a look at a mini P&L for a food and beverage operation, so if we take the sales or the revenues minus the cost of sales, which is a variable cost, that leaves us then with gross profit. And the gross profit needs to cover all of those other costs. So that's why we set a target of 70%, 71, 72% gross profit, because that gross profit then needs to cover a lot of other stuff, a lot of other costs. And so that then leads to what hopefully then is a surplus for that particular area in the business. So if we take each component of that P&L, well, obviously the sales and the revenue depends on how many customers you have and how much they spend. And then our cost of sales, we've said, is a variable cost. Gross profit then needs to cover those remaining costs, which are a combination of variable and fixed, but most of them are fixed costs. Now, if we look at that in the wider context of a bigger P&L, now I know some of you on the webinar today will be working in hotels and working in food and beverage within that sort of bigger business. So food and beverage makes, of course, an important contribution to the overall revenues of the hotel. And then each department that creates revenues will have its own departmental expenses, just as we saw with the previous P&L. And then the overall departmental profits have to cover the overheads of the hotel. So then we've got these range of overheads here, the central costs, if you like, of the business. And then that leads down to gross operating profit, which of course is very different to gross profit. So two really important terms, gross profit for food and beverage, and then gross operating profit for the hotel as a whole. So to help us to manage costs, food cost and gross profit, well, there's a lot of different areas that we could look at, and we don't have time to look at all of those, of course, in this short session this afternoon. We do have longer courses that will look at each of these areas in more detail. But if we look at purchases, first of all, for example, so I'm just going to pick a couple of areas to focus on during this session. If we take a look at the purchasing stage, so in order to manage our gross profit, well, it's about working with your suppliers. Now, you may well be working with nominated suppliers, or you may have more flexibility to choose from a wider variety of suppliers. But the key at the moment is to really negotiate those prices and to shop around. Now, of course, many suppliers at the moment are reticent to fix prices for a long period of time because, of course, they're also facing a lot of flexibility and a lot of change, rather, in those prices. So it's about really shopping around and making sure that you're getting the best price for all of those products that you need. And the local suppliers may also be another alternative. And of course, it does depend on the nature of your operation. So what about stock control? Well, in stock control, it's all about making sure that obviously we have what we need when we need it. And a useful philosophy is a just-in-time approach, which means ordering as you need it. But of course, you also need to balance with making sure that you can get deliveries on a regular basis. So managing stock is all about making sure that you've got the stock that you need, but you're not holding too much stock at any point in time. So a stockroom full of stock obviously means that's money tied up in that inventory. So it's all about making sure that we're holding the appropriate level of stock, ordering as we need and understanding the sort of lead times for those orders, and making sure that we don't end up with out of date stock or dead stock. So it's a real balance to manage our stock levels effectively. Another key aspect of managing our cost of sales and our gross profit is portion control. And we'll be talking about standard recipes in a few moments. But portion control is a really important part of managing the standard cost of each product, each dish, or each drink that we serve. So portion control is critical. Probably on the beverage side, it's easier because you have standard measures and so on. But on the food side of our business, the more we can standardize the portion, the more control we have over the standard cost of each sale. So important to control that cost, not just from the point of view of cost control, but also from the point of view of the customer experience as well, that there is an element of standardization in terms of what they expect for the products that they've ordered. So we can use a range of tools, and standard recipes is the starting point. But of course, we can also use containers and different tools within the business in order to standardize each portion size. And that's actually a really critical element of cost control, because if the product itself is not standardized, then it's almost impossible to keep control of that food cost. So standardized recipes are really key to this, and I'm sure that you've all got standardized recipes that you're using in your food operations. They might be on Excel spreadsheets, they might be on more sophisticated accounting tools and technology to support this. And the key really is to make sure that they are up to date, so that standard recipes contain the correct ingredients, the quantities, and often they also include the procedures as well for making a particular product. And the key is so it's exactly the same each time. So back to that standardization. So we want to control what we're putting into the product. And we also want to make sure that the pricing of the ingredients is also kept up to date as well. So the standard recipe is a tool for communicating how a dish should be produced, what should go into it, and what is the cost of each portion. And so it's worth investing in the technology which enables you to keep your standard recipes up to date based on the latest prices from your supplier. So there are lots of tools around that can help you to do this. So rather than having a standard recipe that was produced maybe a couple of months ago, it goes out of date if it's not kept regularly updated. If you can link it to your purchasing system, then that will then update that recipe on a daily basis, which ultimately gives you an up-to-date picture of what the cost of sales percentage is for each menu item and the corresponding gross profit. So here's a simple little standard recipe. And with a standard recipe, the idea is that you list the quantity of ingredients that goes into making the dish. Now, this isn't for one portion, this is for 8 portions, but many standard recipes would be for 1 portion if each dish is made individually. So this one is for 8 portions, giving us £10.40 as being the cost of the food. So this is the cost on the basis of the cost of the ingredients from the supplier. There's no labour cost in this. It is just solely based on the cost of the ingredients. So we've got a total cost for 8 portions of £10.40. And so that gives us £1.30 per portion. Now let's imagine that this, it looks like a chicken pie, this recipe. So we've got a portion of chicken pie, we've got a portion of vegetables as well at 80p. So that means that the total cost of the food is £2.10 for each portion that we're going to sell. And so here it's critical now to get the right selling price to achieve our target gross profit percentage. So here we're working on a 70% gross profit, which means a 30% cost of sales. That means we want £2.10 to be 30% of the net selling price. So of course our spreadsheets and our accounting tools can do this for us automatically, but it's useful to know how it's done. And that's to take the £2.10, and we want £2.10 to be 30% of the net selling price. So £2.10 divided by 30%, divided by 30, times by 100, and that will give you the 7. Now the £7 is what we call the net selling price. So it's the net selling price, and then to give us the gross selling price, if we charge VAT, and many of us will do, then you have to add 20% to £7, which takes us to £8.40. So this represents the minimum selling price for this dish, because we're making here 8 portions. Well, what if we made 8 but only sold 7? If we only sold 7, then we won't achieve our target gross profit of 70%. So we can adjust the calculation to bring in a percentage for wastage. So normally about 8 to 10% that you could add to the cost per portion, so increase the total cost of the food, and then add your target GP percentage to that. So you can see why it's really important for these standard recipes to be kept up to date, so that you've got the latest prices for the ingredients, and then with those calculations in place, you can then get a recommended selling price. So of course, you may well feel that it's probably prudent to have a selling price which is higher than £8.40 to allow for possible wastage. And of course, if your customer's quite happy to pay £9.99 for the dish, then why not? So this represents the minimum selling price that we should set. So we've said we need to frequently update these, particularly as we saw from the statistics at the beginning. And I noted your question, Ryan, so I'll come back on that to you. Particularly as these ingredients are increasing in cost at really quite a regular rate over the last 12 months. So important to keep these costings updated. And of course, as we said earlier, to be negotiating with our suppliers to look at how we can reduce the cost. And it might be also that we need to tweak the recipe as well. So all of those can be important ways, important points for trying to improve our cost of sales and gross profit. So with food costs remaining high, so whilst there has been some levelling off of costs, they're still pretty high. So we're saying work closely with your suppliers. So working closely with them to try and fix those prices, and really keep reviewing your recipes and the standard costs to make sure that you've got the up-to-date picture of what those costs are. And it might mean that you need to revise the recipe content, or even change your menu items more frequently. And I know from my own experience in the hospitality industry that we're seeing many restaurants regularly updating their menus at the moment to take account of these fluctuations in the prices. So another useful calculation, so we've said calculate your cost of sales, make sure that your standard recipes are up to date. Another sort of useful, interesting calculation is something called the attainable or the theoretical food cost. And you may also be doing this in your organisations. So what's this one about? Well, it's basically a calculation of what we think the cost of sales should be based on what we've sold, so based on the product sales mix. So it's known as the theoretical food cost or the attainable food cost. And it's not a replacement for calculating cost of sales based on the inventories, but it's a useful comparison to have this calculation along with that first cost of sales calculation. So how does it work? So it's always easier to see with some numbers, I think. So let's have a look. Jumped by a bit quickly. There we go. So what do we do? Well, you take the data from your point of sale system. So your point of sale system will be collecting information about what you've sold, so the different food items and how many of each that you've sold. So this table here just represents a snapshot from a point of sale system. So I've just limited this to 5 different menu items. And then we've got a list here of how many were sold. So this could be calculated on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or a monthly basis to tie in maybe with your monthly stock taking. So we've got the numbers sold and then the portion cost. Now, of course, these figures here are going to come from the standard recipes. So we're going to bring those numbers in there from the standard recipe. And then we're just going to simply say, well, if I sold 100 of menu item A, then the cost would be £200. So we're building up a picture of what we think we should have spent on the food based on what we've sold. And then we can compare that to the selling price. Now, this is the net selling price, so without the VAT. So the net selling price. So here we've got some nice simple numbers, £3,000 worth of sales, £1,000 worth of cost. So that means that our theoretical food cost works out to 33.33%. Then what you need to do is to compare that figure to the actual food cost percentage, which is calculated by physically taking stock. So having the opening stock figure, the purchases for the month, what you actually bought from your suppliers, and what you had left at the end of the month. Or if you are working just off of your purchases, then comparing this figure to what you've purchased during the month. Now, the figures will, it's unlikely that the two figures will be the same, because the calculation for opening stock and purchases and closing stock is based on what has actually been used. The attainable or the theoretical food cost is based on what you've sold, but of course the difference is going to be wastage or products that didn't get sold. And so you'll always have a difference in terms of the percentage, but what is useful to track is the margin, the difference between these two percentages. And the aim, of course, is to try to reduce that margin. So it's an interesting additional calculation, and you should have in your businesses all the data available to be able to make the calculation. So you've got information about what you've sold from your point of sale system. You have the portion cost information, which is on the standard recipes. You know how much you're selling the dishes for. And so that way you can bring that data together to get the theoretical food cost. Again, there are technological solutions to this that will make those calculations based on grabbing this data from your systems and even compare it to the calculation for cost of sales from doing the stock take. So how do we reduce the wastage? So I'm going to be using really several ideas from WRAP and from UK Hospitality to give us a bit of a checklist really of how we can reduce the likelihood of food waste occurring. And one area to look at is the number of ingredients that you're purchasing. Now, this is not about making your menus less diverse and less interesting, but it's really looking at what is the total number of different stock units that we're purchasing. And is there any way that we can reduce those so that we reduce the possibility of wastage? So the comparison on the screen is that the more complex a dish is, the more ingredients it's likely to include, but also the larger number of cooking processes are likely to be involved as well. And when you have more cooking processes, if you're moving from one piece of equipment to another, from one utensil to another, all the time, you're increasing the possibility of wastage. And of course, there's the extra labour cost as well. And the calculations we've looked at so far haven't included labour, but labour is also a cost that has really soared in terms of the percentage in comparison to revenue over the last year. So we need to be looking at the chef time, the labour cost, as well as the food cost when we're looking at our overall cost reduction activities. So one tip really is to take a look at the quantity of different stock units that you're purchasing, and you'll be able to see this from your stock sheets, and that will sort of give you a picture of the range and quantity of ingredients that are being purchased. So when you're looking at recipe and menu design, it's really thinking about every new ingredient that you're using, and every new ingredient that you add into your purchasing and menu design is going to put more pressure on reducing wastage and maybe on labour costs as well. So every new ingredient has sort of increases the risk of more food waste occurring. And of course, every new ingredient requires storage as well. So there's additional cost, whether it's chilled or frozen, that will increase the amount of energy cost. And more complexity in the supply chain as well. So really the message from these points is to look at the quantity and the scale of the different ingredients that you're using. So maybe we could reduce the quantity of ingredients on our lists by focusing on the menu items that are most popular with our customers. Well, I expect we're doing that already for a range of reasons. Clearly, the focus should be on selling what our customers want. But trying to also share the recipes, so with some variations for interest. Now, that doesn't mean having the same ingredients in every dish. Obviously, that would make no sense at all. But thinking about how you can share cooking processes and maybe share some of the ingredients across some of the different dishes that we are offering. And really, for every ingredient, it's making sure that you can use it in at least two ways. So that means then that you're reducing the likelihood of wastage arising. As I said earlier, it's not about having the same ingredients across all of the dishes on your menus. Obviously, that would make no practical sense at all. But what we're really aiming to achieve is to make sure that each ingredient has at least one purpose. And then that way that can help to reduce wastage. So I think I just jumped a little ahead there. So let's look at waste in particular. Now, there's a lot of super resources on the WRAP website, and they did some really interesting research based on where does wastage come from. Three areas: spoilage, food preparation, and the food returned on plates. So if we take a look at spoilage waste, So spoilage waste is food that's not even actually got out to the customer. So wastage that's arisen because we haven't used the food in time. So of course, there are lots of practical ways of reducing that likelihood of that occurring. Only ordering what we need, maybe ordering in smaller quantities, and of course, making sure that we manage our stockroom effectively, first in, first out. Good housekeeping, isn't it, really? So things that we do to ensure that we are reducing the amount of possible waste from food, even before we get to the point of preparing it and selling it to the customer. So 3 categories: spoilage waste. And spoilage waste is really directly connected to how much we order and how much we stock. And we mentioned earlier the importance of making sure that we don't have too much money tied up in inventory. So there is a way to measure this, and we can actually put a figure to how much inventory we're holding in the business. Now, you might be thinking, oh, this looks like a bit of a complicated calculation. Have a chat to your finance teams. They're probably doing this calculation because they already have the data. So they already know how much inventory you have. And we also know what our cost of sales are. So if we were looking at, say, a month of 30 days, so September with 30 days, and if we were to say that during the course of the month, we had £100,000 worth of cost of sales. So we're using £100,000 worth of food during the course of the month. If we're holding at any point in time, let's say £10,000 worth of food, then that means that that food would last us for 3 days. So that's called the length of time that food is sitting in our business. So it's called the inventory days calculation. Now that's an average. And you can get more detailed. You can look at inventory days for different groupings of food items. But even the overall average is a useful measure, particularly if you are focusing on reducing the amount of inventory that you're holding at any time. And then, of course, it's useful if you're focusing on that strategy to be able to measure the impact of the actions that you're taking. So this is a useful measure, and you already have the data in your business because you already know what inventory you're holding and you know what your cost of sales will be. So that's a useful measure, and you might like to have a chat with your finance teams about the availability of that measure along with cost of sales and gross profit percentages. So with the data that we've just been looking at, I think I probably gave you the answer already, but 3 days based on £10,000 worth of stock, total cost of sales of 100,000. So what about preparation waste? So we talked about spoilage. Preparation waste is about making sure that we're really focusing on the processes that we use to ensure that we minimize the amount of waste from food during the preparation stage. So there's hundreds of ideas, thousands of ideas for this, YouTube, lots of hospitality websites as well, in terms of how to use the leftover ingredients more effectively. So whether it's making soups, whether it's making stocks, but looking at how to use the whole of the product that we're purchasing, whether it's vegetables, fruit, meat, and so on. And then finally, plate waste. Well, the third area that WRAP has focused on in their research is looking at how much waste comes back to the kitchen from the plate. And well, we could argue, well, does it matter because it's already in the costing? So we've already costed for the dish, and the gross profit and the selling price will take account of the size of that portion. But of course, if we see the same food coming back time and time again, then it is telling us that perhaps the portion size is too large, or perhaps the garnish is not wanted. And so then we should take some action based on that, just to really reduce the amount of plate waste that's taking place. Again, there are technological solutions to help us with managing this. So you can use some tools to help you to measure the amount of plate waste and even to value it. But even without investing in that type of technology, we can simply use our eyes to look at what quantity of plate waste is coming back. And it can be a useful exercise in the kitchen to have clear plastic bags for food waste. So that really then highlights, what is going into those bags rather than black plastic bags. And then if space and time allow, to actually separate out the waste from the different sources. So waste from preparation, waste from spoilage, and waste from coming back from the customer's plate. Because that then gives a lot more insight into where is the waste coming from, and then you can target your activities into those specific areas. So WRAP provide lots of useful hints and tips, resources, and even training programs to help us with controlling and reducing food waste. So they have a scheme called the Guardians of Grub, and that has its own website. And then there's also the WRAP website as well. So lots of places to get additional information. So I've listed here Guardians of Grub, the article that came from Forth that we talked about earlier. And UK Hospitality also has a number of guides on their website as well, looking specifically at reducing food waste. And then my own company has a site called Finance for Hospitality, and this is some online resources to help us with controlling the finances in our business. So lots of sources for getting additional information about controlling food cost. And if you'd like the slides from today's session, then of course just drop me an email and I'll be able to send those over to you and tell you a bit more as well about Finance for Hospitality. So we've also recently launched our Finance for Hospitality community, which is a subscription service for all those who want to find out more really about hospitality accounting and keep up to date with the latest trends and techniques. So it's a range of online resources that are updated on a regular basis so that you can revise those cost of sales calculations or find out more about wage and salary cost controls or understanding the P&L overall or the balance sheet and the cash flow. So all those important documents within your business. And so Finance for Hospitality is all about a community really for all those who are interested in finance related topics in the hospitality industry. So we work on a subscription basis, so 1 month at a time, and obviously if you 1 month's membership or 6 months membership, whatever suits you. And during that time we will bring you regular news and updates on hospitality financial reporting, but also lots of resources and bite-sized learning opportunities. And free webinars each month as well. So again, if this is something of interest, then do drop me a line and I'll be able to tell you a bit more about it. So our next webinar is going to be next month on the 20th of October. And in that session, we're going to be talking about flow-through analysis. But we do have a few minutes left for today's webinar, so do feel free to pop any other questions into the Q&A. So Ryan, you asked, do you have one for beverage costing? Did you mean a formula for beverage costing, or did you mean some statistics? I probably have both, so let me know which you were focusing on there with that particular question. So a formula. So for beverage costing, it's the same formula for working out the cost of sales. So we had the opening inventory plus the purchases minus the closing inventory. And most businesses will use that formula for beverage every month by taking stock. So you only take stock once per month. So the opening stock will be last month's closing stock, and then add to that the value of the purchases, and then take stock at the end of the month again to give you the closing stock figure. I think the majority of food and beverage businesses actually do the monthly stock take for beverage, but maybe not so frequently for food. So with food, the ideal is to do a monthly stock take because that does really give you the most accurate picture of what you're using. But if you feel that your stock levels are consistent throughout the month, then purchases gives a good reflection of what the cost of sales will be. But I always say with that, it is better to take stock because you have got then an accurate picture of the amount of food that you're actually using. And sometimes I hear chefs say, well, I can't order because it's going to mess up my cost of sales, my GP calculation. And that shouldn't be hindering when you need to order. You need to order what you need when you need it. So that's when the opening stock plus purchases minus closing stock calculation is maybe is better to use. Now, if you have an outlet in your business where you are really concerned about the control of cost of sales and gross profit, then in that case, it's often better to go to weekly, because when you only have 7 days worth of data, it's much easier to be able to track where the problems might be. So the problems, of course, would be spending too much on food, so a high cost of sales percentage and a lower corresponding gross profit. And there are a range of possible causes for that. So today we've talked about the standard recipes and the cost of the food that we're purchasing. But of course, other factors that can cause our cost of sales to go up can be increased wastage, pilferage, the sales not being recorded in the first place, so we're not getting the sales going through the till. So perhaps some food has been given away free to friends or whatever it might be. Perhaps we're not getting credit notes back from suppliers. That can be another factor as well. So there are lots of things to consider when you're trying to control that cost of sales percentage and the corresponding gross profit percentage. And really, from what we looked at the beginning of today's session, you can see how important it is to manage that GP percentage, because the gross profit has got to cover all of the other costs. So that's why we work with figures which are 70%, 70% plus, and it's not about making a huge amount of profit, because it's hard to make a huge amount of profit in F&B. That gross profit has got to then cover all of those other costs, the wages, the salaries, the utility costs, the rates, all the other costs in your P&L. And so that's why controlling the GP is so important as the starting point. So thank you very much for joining me for the session today. I hope you found it useful. I know it was quite a race through a number of different concepts. But as I say, the slides are available if you'd like to have them to recap. So just let me know if you'd like me to pop out a copy to you. And as I say, our next session is on the 20th of October, when we're going to be talking about flow-through. So flow-through is the relationship between revenue and gross operating profit. So from the beginning of today's session, you will remember that gross operating profit is what you have after you've taken into account all of the other costs in your P&L. And so it's a very important level of profitability. And flow-through is about the conversion of each pound of revenue into gross operating profit. And of course, that varies with where the revenue came from. And that's the topic that we're going to discuss in more detail on the 20th of October. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and it just remains for me to wish you a wonderful weekend.